Hello everyone and welcome into yet another edition of the GSMC Deadball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name as always is your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for joining me on this wonderful Tuesday afternoon, and what a show it is that will include a recap of the NFC Championship Game between the Commanders and Eagles, looking ahead to the 2025 NFL Draft, doing a top 5 prospective mock draft of sorts. Then I'm looking at the MLB Hall of Fame inductees, finally getting to acknowledge them after they were just announced last week. Then I'm also going to be previewing a big game, finally an interconference game in the NBA between the Nuggets and the Knicks. Two teams kind of looking to get on the right track. The Nuggets more so than the Knicks right now. And then last but not least, concluding by continually looking at all these CFP appearances, all these teams rather that made it to the CFP and who might be retooling for next year. This time we profile the Oregon Ducks and what they need to do to get back to the CFP and maybe even beyond in the CFP as well. But without further ado, before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you as always to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as always. Just helps us that much more. Genuinely appreciated by all concerned. But another way that you can contribute and interact with the shows a little bit more directly is to make yourselves available to their super chat, super thanks, and super stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcspodcast.net, to leave your opinions, feedback, inputs, or even a tip or donation if you feel so inclined. It greatly supports our network, greatly supports our shows, and just makes them that much better hearing all of your lovely feedback. We genuinely appreciate it. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's show, starting off, as always, by recapping the NFC Championship Game between the Commanders and Eagles. Now, I would like to say that this wasn't as bad a game as people thought it was, but I do think that the Commanders were their own worst enemies in this one. I think that a lot of the times people are going to look back on this game and say, well, the Eagles were the far superior team, and there was no way that the Commanders would have kept pace with them anyways. But the Commanders really didn't help themselves in any singular regard this weekend. But they did do some good things. There were some silver linings to this performance, but Philly was just a more physical, dominant team that broke a lot of records in this game, kind of showing how Philadelphia football is going to look like for the next 5 years or so, showing how the NFL is going to have to deal with their brand of football. And I think that ultimately Washington is well equipped to rebuild upon this season and create more around Jaden Daniels, but it's going to be very tough to beat this team, the division rival, come next year as well, because they're well equipped for this style of play in the NFL, and they're going to dictate that style of play and how teams will have to adapt to it in terms of the next couple of years, because there's no way this team is breaking up anytime soon. And if they ever do, then Howie Roseman has proven that he can just find a lot more pieces to add to the puzzle. But let's just get right into what happened during this game, the key factors that made this such a blowout, and ultimately what the Commanders did well and reasons of optimism for why they are considered a team to look out for in the future, but also what needs to happen in order to help eliminate some of those mistakes that initially happened in this one. But let's talk about the Commanders first before we get into what the Eagles did very well, because we have to talk about Jaden Daniels in this one, because he ultimately was their best player, continuously looked unflappable in this one, no matter how much pressure the Eagles were generating, no matter how inept his wide receivers looked at different times throughout this game. He still completed 29 of his 48 pass attempts for 236 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Still looked very much like a competent NFL quarterback and not like the rookie he was. Unfortunately, though, his team was just not strong enough around him on the day to cope with this very, very physical Philadelphia Eagles team. And that's ultimately the difference in this one. I really can't pinpoint any other Washington Commander who really stepped up to the plate and played with their hearts out. A lot of them felt like they were playing with house money, just wanted to go out there, have fun, rather than, actually make a game of this, because there were moments where they had chances. Look at that kickoff after the Eagles scored to go up 8 at the end of the half with the Austin Eckler fumble. We'll talk about that a little more and how that might have affected the outcome of this game as well. But every time it seemed like the Commanders could have seized a little bit of momentum, the Eagles just proved that they were far superior with what they were able to put together. No one on the Washington defense really stood out to me. No one on the Washington offense outside of Daniels and maybe, say, Terry McLaurin really stood out to me in this game. But ultimately, it's a nice kind of litmus test for them. Kind of brought them back down to earth. Brought them back to reality. To say, we made it this far, but we're definitely not ready just yet. It showed the stark differences and contrast between a Super Bowl caliber team and a team that was performing well above its station for large parts of the year. Not to say that they didn't deserve to get blown out, but this game was a reality check for Washington. It proved that they might have staying power for the next couple of years, but it proved that they also need to build around the core that they've already started putting forth in Washington. Now let's talk about the Philadelphia Eagles, because this was perhaps the most impressive performance by any team in the history of the NFL in a championship game. The 55 points scored, most ever in either an NFC or AFC championship game. The 7 rushing touchdowns, most ever in a championship game. Also, the fact that Jalen Hurts looked like a competent passer after a week of people doubting whether or not he would even look healthy enough to lead the Eagles should they need to pass the football a little bit more, really showed the versatility of what this Philadelphia Eagles offense can present to you. And Saquon scoring on his first 2 touchdowns of the game, forget about it. I feel like this was the Eagles' game to just dominate and prove that this style of football is kind of what's going to dominate the NFL for years to come. This run-heavy philosophy, combined with a quarterback who can give you just enough in the pass game with the versatile weapons that he has, but also present that dual threat look. I feel like the Phillies are presenting a modern style of football that not a lot of teams will be able to beat. And it's funny because we look at all the conference championship teams. They all have mobile quarterbacks. And for some way or not, all of them kind of dictated how their offenses performed. On the Washington side of things, Jaden Daniels was their best rusher by a long shot. No signs of life from Brian Robinson or Austin Eckler or anyone else in that running back room. But ultimately, the reason why I want to highlight Jalen Hurts' performance is not just for his 3 rushing touchdowns, but also for what he was able to do through the air after everyone was downing him all week long in terms of what difference he can make in the passing game. 20 of 28, 246 yards, 1 touchdown. And ultimately, it doesn't look too flashy, but it was certainly significant that it was able to pass for over 200 yards after not even surpassing 150 in the first 2 playoff games. That, combined with the fact that they could rush for 7 rushing touchdowns, most ever in a championship game, just makes this team so hard to beat. And the fact that we haven't even mentioned Saquon's stats is incredible to behold, because that's what this team does to you. And coming into this game, one of the ways I believed that Washington could keep this close was not just by getting out to an early lead, but also keying in on the run, because they knew they had to. Even though they were the worst run defense in the playoffs and one of the worst in the regular season, they knew they had to stop the run. And if they couldn't, it's just too powerful of an offensive line. You have 2 fantastic runners in that backfield, and not just Barkley, but Hurts as well. that you have to account for. And even with all the injuries to that offensive line throughout the game, Jurgens going down, Landon Dickerson limping off, it's still held up. And that's going to be something to watch for in the Super Bowl when they go up against the Chiefs' defensive front that's really making hay in the postseason. But I do want to point out the fumbles here, because the Eagles' defense, someone that we didn't even talk about in this segment just yet, but the 3 fumbles really standing out to me, because this Washington football team had not been turning the ball over very often in the regular season and in the playoffs. They're going up against this fantastic Eagles defense. You gotta make sure, even if you're getting your doors blown off, that you protect the football. And they just didn't. Even in moments where there was no way they could come back, they looked a little bit unsure of themselves, the receivers. And that's something that they have to address and fix in the offseason. You need to have guys who can secure the football, sustain drives, and ultimately put points on the board. And they can do that in certain games. They did it against Detroit, but ultimately they're going to have to find ways to beat up on this Philadelphia Eagles defense a little bit differently than they tried in this one, because it didn't work. The 3 fumbles, especially the one with Austin Eckler on the kickoff after the Eagles had scored, potentially giving your team a chance to draw down the field, tie it up before the half. Ultimately, that fumble really hurt them. Ultimately, that's the difference between these two teams. The Eagles have 2 dominant units on the field. Washington has about 1.5. I feel like their offense is getting there, and at certain times they have gotten there throughout the season, but this defense certainly needs to step up. And sometimes, as well, the offense gets a little bit more pressured in a game of this magnitude, especially against a divisional opponent on the road. So that's something they have to account for in the offseason. Finding guys who can win you football games by securing the football, not making mistakes, and then ultimately really shoring up this defense, because even though it has a lot of veterans and a lot of young guys mixed together, it's not quite there yet. It's not quite the caliber defense that is required to reach a Super Bowl. So that's going to have to be asked in the offseason. But congratulations to the Philadelphia Eagles for proving that they can be dominant in every facet of a football game, scoring the most ever in a championship game, going up in a rematch against the Chiefs for NFL supremacy. It's going to be a good one. Hopefully, it's going to be a good game no matter what other fans, armchair fans of the NFL, think about it. But ultimately, they proved it. And the Commanders are just one step too short of the Super Bowl. They're not quite there yet, but they could definitely get there in the future. But let me know what you think about this game in the comments below, because coming next we do a little mini mock draft of sorts to look at the top 5 prospective picks in the 2025 NFL Draft right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And coming up, before we enter into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you as always to consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube as always. best way to contribute and interact with the shows a little bit more directly while we are live streaming. You can also do it through our website, gsmcspodcast.net. It is genuinely appreciated whatever way you choose to support us. It just makes this show and others around the network that much better. Without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment, doing a mini mock draft of sorts. The college football season is done. The NFL season is almost over. As we look ahead, we have to consider mock drafts and what top prospects could potentially be taken in the first round, specifically amongst these 5 picks, the top 5 picks in the NFL draft. A lot of teams talk about potential trades up. A lot of teams thinking that they can stay put. A lot of teams with organizational tension that might determine whether or not they trade down or up in this draft. So it's going to be an interesting examination over these next couple of months of these top 5 picks. Without further ado, let's jump into my mini mock draft as of right now and how I see all 5 of the teams in the top 5 picking in this one. Without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Starting off with the Tennessee Titans. A lot of talk with this number 1 pick. A lot of talk now that the Titans have a new GM in Mike Bergonzi about whether or not they might trade down to gain more draft capital, as they have a lot of areas of need, quarterback notwithstanding, but also in that secondary. A lot of help is needed up front. Harold Landry and Jeffrey Simmons cannot do it on their own. But ultimately, I think they stand pat and become enamored with potentially the top quarterback in this draft class, depending on how different pundits view him. Cam Ward, I think they become enamored by his poise, by his unflappability, his quick release, and his ability to lead his team in critical moments, much like he did throughout most of the season. He has the skills needed in certain moments, and he kind of reminds me of a little bit of Jaden Daniels combined a little bit with another QB in this class in terms of dual threat ability, Dillon Gabriel. It's that he kind of uses his dual threat ability in certain situations, but it's not necessarily as pronounced as, say, a Dillon Gabriel, who I'm really looking at as an under-the-radar quarterback in this class. But I digress, because we're talking about someone in Cam Ward who I think the Tennessee Titans can't ignore. They don't want to go into another season with Will Levis, and I feel like Cam Ward is solid enough for the Titans to not pass up on him. They have to address, in my opinion, the quarterback position. Above all else, there's a lot of talent in other areas in this draft class that they can address in latter rounds, but they had the worst QBR in the NFL and the most interceptions. They have to address that area of need most importantly, and I don't necessarily think it's going to be answered by going into next season with Will Levis back at the helm or potentially Mason Rudolph. So Cam Ward is the pick for me if I'm the Titans GM, and I don't necessarily think Mike Bergonzi wants to start his era as the new Titans GM off on the wrong foot. So they make this decision. Now let's go into a team that's kind of tough to gauge here with the Cleveland Browns, because they have a lot of issues off the field as well as on, considering the fact that the quarterback debate's now up in the air. Deshaun obviously re-tore his Achilles. Obviously, you can't move him on because of that huge contract and how much cap space you will be eating by releasing him before a certain date. But ultimately, I think that the astute pick lies in the generational two-way talents here, because I think Kevin Stefanski, as he resumes play calling, will have a lot of fun with him on the offensive side of the football at the very least. Travis Hunter, I think the Browns will utilize him a lot in wide receiver packages, maybe not so much in the secondary, although it kind of regressed the mean a little bit. The secondary is one of the stronger parts of this Browns team. But ultimately, even though a lot of people could be saying they draft Shador here, I don't see it. The Browns feel like more of a team that's going to address this quarterback issue in free agency, or potentially by drafting someone, say, in the 3rd to 4th round, maybe a guy like Will Howard, a guy like Dillon Gabriel to develop behind, say, a bridge starter, like potentially a Kirk Cousins, a Derek Carr, or something like that. But ultimately, Travis Hunter would still be a fascinating pick for this Browns team. Another kind of gadget player, a little bit in the mold of Myles Garrett, except that he plays both ways, and Kevin Stefanski will be loving him in his offense, because as one of those guys who loves to have control of his offense as the head coach, he's going to utilize a lot of different ways for Travis Hunter to touch the football on both sides of the field. But ultimately, I feel like if the Browns view him more as a wide receiver, that will lead to their benefit a lot more, just because of the fact that they need an elite winner on the perimeter. I feel like this Browns receiving core headed into the season is a little bit underrated. Ultimately, doesn't have, outside of Jerry Jeudy, another guy who is intelligent enough to run routes, but also to test opposing defenses vertically. And Travis Hunter can do both. He has elite ball skills for playing both ways, and the Browns will love him no matter who's at the quarterback position next year, and no matter what plays Kevin Stefanski dials up for him. So the Browns, if I were them, I would pick Mr. Travis Hunter, and he would be a boon for this organization. Then the number 3 pick, the moment everyone in the tri-state area is waiting for, the words they want to hear, the New York Football Giants get their guy in Shedeur Sanders. I believe that Shedeur will fall to the Giants. They won't necessarily have to trade up to 1 because I think the Titans will be a little bit more enamored with Cam Ward than Shedeur Sanders. And it's not like Shedeur Sanders is the worst quarterback if people view him that way. It's just that it's very difficult to kind of see someone as more superior to the other right now. They're very close. They're very similar. Very few things separate them, but I do feel like the Titans like a guy a little bit more like Cam Ward, who's a little bit more fearless, like what they thought Will Levis was going to be, than a guy like Shedeur Sanders. But the Giants fans are not going to be mad about it, but ultimately I do feel like Shedeur is the right pick here for them. Because A, he's in a big media market, which his father will love, and B, I feel like he knows how it feels to not be behind the best of offensive lines, and his improvisation will certainly help in that department. I feel like his decision-making is better than Cam Ward in some regards because of the fact he does not have as solid of an offensive line as Cam Ward had. So ultimately, that comes into play for how his play style translates to the NFL. It's a little bit more fast and loose, but he is one of the more accurate quarterbacks you'll find in this class. So that shouldn't be a problem. So ultimately, I feel like the Giants will be very happy if Shedeur falls there, but it's going to come down to how they build up this offensive line of the year, because Shedeur Sanders was fine with it in college, but if the first 5 or so years of his NFL career this offensive line doesn't improve, he might grow as disgruntled as other Giants QBs before him in that very, very powerful media market, in this very powerful media market, because as I live in the tri-state area and I know what it can do to a player. But ultimately, Shedeur, very early on in his career, won't necessarily have to worry about all the media monsters attacking him just yet. But that he will have to worry if the Giants also don't address the offensive line. But I do think they will, and ultimately Shedeur will be primed to become a little bit more confident in some of his decision-making areas. So, with that though, I think that the Giants get their guy that they believe can bring back this franchise. And ultimately, New York Giants fans will have something to hope about for the next 5 to 10 years. But ultimately, it should be an exciting pick to follow in the top 5, as potentially the Giants could feel that they have to trade up should Tennessee also become enamored with Sanders as well. But now we get into these 4 and 5 picks with 2 teams that have very interesting questions to answer almost every single area of the field, outside of, say, their quarterbacks. They feel like they know who their quarterbacks are. So let's start at number 4, the New England Patriots, and who they might take. A lot of options could be available to them here. They could go O-line to better protect Drake May. They could go cornerback, although it would be a little bit early for some of the guys in this year's draft. But ultimately, I think they pick Abdul Carter because they need to start building up this pass rush, and I believe that Abdul Carter is not just one of the best edge rushers in this draft, but one of the best overall prospects in this draft. It immediately bolsters this Patriots pass rush, who doesn't necessarily have anyone outside of, say, Keon White. He has 12 sacks last year, 23.5 tackles for loss throughout his entire Penn State career. So it just bolsters that pass rush, gives it a different flavor, allows this secondary to grow in their first year under Mike Vrabel, allows them to become a bit more physical in their man-to-man style, just builds up from the ground zero that they had in their pass rush to make it so that it's not necessarily too difficult for Mike Vrabel to retool this defense. If they get a prospect like Abdul Carter, what I'm saying is that he immediately gives this defense a high profile in terms of how they can build from the top, from the bottom to the top, because the top is already in the secondary very, very high end, but you need some guys in the front, in the middle, to really shore it up, and Abdul Carter is a big step forward in that department as well. So I think the Pats will pick the no-brainer decision here and just go for the best defensive prospect they possibly can at this juncture in the draft. And in my opinion, that young man is Abdul Carter. Then in terms of Jacksonville's pick, another team with a lot of different options available to them, a lot of different questions to answer defensively in terms of how this unit will look under Liam Cohen, who is obviously a much more offensive-minded head coach. But I do feel like the right path to go here is defense, because you are starting to build a very special unit over there in Jacksonville. Played a lot of teams tough last year, really surprised a lot of the top contenders, whether they be in the NFC or AFC. So I think picking a guy like Mason Graham in the interior of that defensive line, but also can move to the edge, can really create some versatility and depth in your front seven. He pairs very well with a guy like Josh Hines-Allen, Trayvon Walker, a former number 1 overall pick, one of the top tacklers in the NFL. I'm forgetting his name. Oluokun. I feel like that core four is really going to be very potent, and it also helps out the secondary as well. They might address that in the latter stages of the draft, but ultimately, if you find a guy in the top 5 picks like Mason Graham, add him to the interior of your D-line, then later in the draft, say you find a nice pickup in the second round, because I think a lot of corners and safeties are going to fall in this year's draft to compensate for a lot of these offensive linemen, potentially a couple of quarterbacks sneaking in. So ultimately, if the Jags benefit from that, from teams being a little too impatient trying to move up for their guy, and they stay pat, they could build a nice defense here, even though Liam Cohen might want to focus a little bit more on the offense as the draft goes on. So Mason Graham could be a very solid pick here at 5 for Jacksonville as they move one step closer to building an elite defense. But let me know what you think about the top 5 picks in this year's draft, if you are a fan of any of these teams, because coming up next, we transition into the world of baseball, acknowledging the MLB Hall of Fame inductees, finally getting a chance to look at this very special class, which, if you live in the tri-state area like myself, really gave you some of the best years of their careers with your respective teams. So without further ado, right after this short break, we'll get right into that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of today's show, we are transitioning into the world of baseball, acknowledging finally this MLB Hall of Fame class. Only 3 members, but very pivotal members, especially if, like me, you grew up in the tri-state area. Some of their best years came with both the Yankees and the Mets, no matter where they ended up. Ultimately, a very special class for this part of the country. But all 3 of these guys, in their own right, made an impact on their generations. Whether it was one of the most iconic hitters of his time, one of the more intriguingly unique, dominant pitchers of his era, or one of the elite closers of the early thousands and early 2010s as well. I feel like this class left an indelible mark in the early 2000s era of baseball in a very healthy way for the sport. And the fact that they did it in high-profile markets, some starting off their careers in smaller markets as well, and really making a name for themselves later on in their careers, really goes to show the power that the sport has in terms of molding these Hall of Famers. And so without further ado, let's respect and acknowledge a small class, but a special one nonetheless. Let's start off with the only batter, the only true hitter in this year's draft, or perhaps one of the most iconic hitters of an entire generation, Mr. Ichiro Suzuki. And I feel like if you combine his Japanese career with his MLB career, you can't deny the fact, no matter if you're a Yankees fan, a Mets fan, or even a Mariners fan, where he spent some of his best years of his career, I feel like he has to be considered one of the great hitters of all time, maybe even the best. He was an almost unanimous decision, 99.97%. Only one voter did not vote for this man to get into the Hall of Fame. Just goes to show how much respect he holds, how much of an impact he made in the sport, both internationally and in the States, and ultimately had a tremendous career, even, unlike a lot of these Japanese stars coming into the league now, at a disadvantage in terms of how primarily old he was when he first arrived in the MLB. So, in Japan, to recap his career, had over 1,200 hits there. Had over 2,500 hits with Seattle. His first ever season was a great year for them when they won 116 games with the 2001 Rookie of the Year that year at 27 years of age. Two-time batting champion, 10-time All-Star. Career average, .311 batting average, 117 home runs, 708 RBIs with the Mariners, Yankees, and Marlins throughout his career. So ultimately someone who defined the art of hitting in MLB, someone who's greatly appreciated no matter how many World Series he didn't win throughout his career, no matter how many times he was doubted for his small frame, no matter how many times was doubted for his defensive capabilities, he always rose above it. He really became a special player who defined how the MLB now might view international stars in the future, and are already beginning to view them as such, as these prime examples of supremacy both internationally and how they could potentially translate to the States. And Ichiro really set that era forth, because at the age of 27, if you're an international star, you might not want to then go to a league where your profile is going to immediately be heightened, but most importantly questioned as well. And he stepped into this media market, at the time Seattle not being a big one, and completely transformed it to the point where he became someone whose style of play was never questioned, even though he was one of the most unique hitters and one of the most iconic hitters of his generation. And so, to acknowledge someone of his caliber is so intriguing, considering how we now see guys like Shohei Ohtani and now Roki Sasaki, who's going to enter his first year in the league, because they have much more of an opportunity now as younger international stars to create a sensation in the MLB. Ichiro had a very limited amount of time, but because of that time, he was able to adapt to the MLB and create this aura of longevity that will stand the test of time, and is the main reason why he was one vote short of being a unanimous pick for the MLB Hall of Fame. So Ichiro Suzuki, I salute you, one of the great hitters of his generation, defined what international superstardom can translate into in an MLB career. But then let's get into the two pitchers here. First, the starter, Mr. CC Sabathia. A little bit controversial to some, considering the fact that he kind of slowed down throughout his career, never truly was at the top of his game, as a lot of people said he was, never really, quote-unquote, the most dominant pitcher you could think of from the Yankees dynasty in the early 2000s, still someone who stood the test of time, clearly adapted to the league, clearly adapted to how he had to pitch in certain situations, but ultimately someone who I greatly respect because of his adaptability and his longevity as well in the MLB. Because early on in the 2000s, it became quite clear that pitchers would not go as deep into games as they used to. And furthermore, they ultimately had to adapt as they got older in terms of how quickly they threw the baseball. They sometimes had to adapt to accommodate for the lack of speed they lost in their off-season, lack of velocity they might have lost, and had to thus throw a couple more off-speed pitches and add them to their arsenal. CC Sabathia was ultimately one of the prime examples of that. Let's talk about his career. Only one of 19 pitchers in the Hall of Fame with 3,000 strikeouts. Third amongst lefties in terms of strikeouts with 3,043. Went 11-2 to start his career with the Milwaukee Brewers, where ultimately, much like Ichiro, he started out in a small market and really made a name for himself in that postseason with a 2.65 ERA, and he ultimately put the Brewers on the map in terms of getting to the postseason. And I feel like he's someone who, even though his career was defined for his time in New York, constantly reminded us that he always had that small market underdog mentality, even though a lot of people early on in his career thought he was going to be the man. Because throughout his tenure with the Yankees, he had success early on. But ultimately, as the years went on and age started to be a factor, a lot of people doubted how a guy like CC Sabathia, who started off as more of your traditional flamethrower, would adapt to the league. And in terms of that, I respect him a lot more for the latter stages of his career than for the early stages of his career. Because the early stages of his career, he won with power. He won with dominance. He won with stats. But in the latter stages of his career, he started to win a little bit more with finesse, a little bit more with off-speed, a little bit more with trickery. And that's something that was difficult in his era to see translate into what we now view in terms of pitchers. Because CC was someone in an era that really respected the flame-throwing lefty. And so to see him throughout his career continue on, despite the fact that he may not have been appealing to a lot of fans in terms of how he slowed down a lot of his pitches, in terms of how he had to adapt to the league, it stood out to me because this could have been a guy who quit at the peak of his powers, but he endured and adapted, and that's something that I have to respect in terms of where we view him in the history of baseball, especially in that early 2000s, early 2010s, and then the late 2010s era of baseball, especially in that very difficult New York market towards the latter stages of his career. But then last but not least, in this very hallowed class, the closer. One of the great closers of all time. Maybe not as fond and remembered in this area of the country as others, mainly because of that 2007 season. I'm looking at you, Mets fans, but ultimately still someone who is respected as one of the great closers and relievers of his era. He truly defined what a early 2000s reliever looked like, someone who could go multiple innings, someone who had that stud nature in him, someone who had the ice in his veins, Billy Wagner. Whether it was with the Astros, whether it was with the Phillies, the Mets, the Red Sox, the Braves in the latter stage of his career, he was someone who dominated his role in the MLB rather. Someone who dominated the reliever role no matter where he went. 422 career saves. 25th. No, I don't know what I wrote in my notes here. That's the 8th most in history, though. He went 47-40 with a 2.31 ERA, closing for the Astros, Phillies, Mets, Sox, and Braves. His 11.9 strikeouts per 9 innings, most among pitchers with at least 900 innings pitched, and someone who is highly regarded as the progenitor of the early 2000s relieving style. A guy who could go 2 to 3 innings. A guy who could go 4 innings maybe. A guy who pitchers weren't worried about when they exited games. The pitchers could rely upon to get them out of sticky situations. Billy Wagner truly defined that role in this era of baseball, and truly is someone that no matter how fondly or poorly you remember him, still is one of the great closers of all time. So there you have it. A perfect class, no matter how small in size it is. One of the great hitters of this generation, one of the most underrated pitchers of this generation, and a great closer to close out this class. How beautiful is that in one of America's most beautiful pastimes, the sport of baseball. And I'm glad that I was able to acknowledge this class before it came too late. But let me know what you think about this class in the comment section below. But coming up next, we look at an interconference game, finally, here on the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast in the NBA between the Nuggets and Knicks that will take place tomorrow night. Two teams looking to get on track in their respective conferences right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for our fourth segment of today's show, we transition yet again from sport to sport here, from baseball to the NBA. We, for the first time ever on the show, I believe, are talking about an interconference matchup between two title contenders in the NBA this season. The Denver Nuggets taking on the New York Knicks, will leave on the road tomorrow night in a game between two teams that one being on track, the other trying to get back on track, but both believe that they can be true title contenders come postseason. The New York Knicks, let's talk about them first, seemingly on the right track to do that, coalescing at the exact right time. They're within one game of the second place Boston Celtics, who are really faltering here in the midway point of the season. Ultimately, let's focus on them. Let's focus on the versatility they have. Let's focus on the stubbornness of Coach Tom Thibodeau to keep that core five on the court for as long as possible, no matter what. And the heart they bring, no pun intended, as Josh Hart is one of the starters on this team, to every single game in this 5-game winning streak. Last night, they proved that they might be a team to be reckoned with if they even get to the NBA Finals, because that was a prospective NBA Finals matchup last night between them and the Grizzlies, and they absolutely obliterated them. Mikal Bridges really coming into his own, truly one of the better free agent acquisitions this offseason in the NBA. Ultimately, I do feel like if any team is similar to the Knicks in terms of how many questions are going to be asked about them come postseason time and how they kind of would like to play a little bit, but not necessarily in too many similar ways, it's the Denver Nuggets. The Denver Nuggets are definitely a team that center around one player, but also are kind of reliant on the same philosophies as the Knicks, in that they really need that one player to show up in the minutes that he plays in order for them to be successful. But ultimately, the Nuggets' plan is not working as well as it was, say, 4 years ago, or even the championship year. Ultimately, Nikola Jokic is still playing like an MVP caliber player, and if he continues to play like that, they still have a fighting chance no matter what happens to them and no matter what opponent they face. But they're now looking at They're staring down the barrel of a 3-game losing streak potentially. Should they lose this game, they lost to the Bills in embarrassing fashion on the road. Jokic, though, still putting up a triple-double. So, even though this team is struggling, they still have one of the best players in the NBA to help compensate for their struggles. But right now, they are 4th in the Western Conference and looking for a signature win. But ultimately, I feel like the Knicks are catching fire, because my worry about this Knicks team was that they wouldn't necessarily coalesce at certain points of the season where they needed to. And this specific part of the season is crunch time for a lot of these title contenders. And I really worried that the Knicks out of play, especially under Tom Thibodeau, would catch up to some of these guys like Bridges and Towns, who may not have been used to it on their other teams. But they have fit in like a glove. They're really being proactive in terms of what they can bring to this squad and really papering over the cracks in the Knicks' depth that a lot of people don't want you to talk to them about. But ultimately, the reason why this game is still even, in my opinion, is because the Nuggets are getting asked the same questions, but they also have the ultimate better player in this matchup. I feel like no matter what, Nikola Jokic is going to, by hook or by crook, keep his team in a lot of games, even if they're overmatched. And I feel like, even though this isn't Jamal Murray's best season, he's starting to rev it up a little bit. He's starting to shoot at least 50% from the field, average 21 and 7, not bad, but certainly not the stats you would love to see from a second option on that Denver Nuggets team. And ultimately, yes, they also have a lot of depth questions, but I feel like Michael Malone, at the very least, knows that he needs to get production out of some of these guys at his bench. And I feel like he is starting to rely on them a little bit more so that they don't feel overwhelmed in certain big moments down the stretch. So I feel like this Denver Nuggets team, even though they're in the midst of a little bit of a losing streak, have the ability to amp it up. They just need to rely on these younger guys really amping it up a little bit down the stretch here. It's not just going to be Jokic and a group of 4 guys on a court. It's going to be key contributors popping up in certain moments. The Nuggets, to me, are kind of like the Celtics of the Western Conference right now. They have the players, they have the talent, they're just not clicking outside of their core players, right? All their core players are playing pretty well, so to speak, but ultimately they're not getting key contributions from other players in critical moments. And that's the difference between them and some other elite teams that I feel at this point are primed and ready to go come postseason time. And if you were to start the postseason now, would probably carry over their record, their form as well. And one of those teams would be the New York Knicks. Because looking at the Knicks, in this 5-game winning streak, they dominated the Kings, one of those teams who are hot and cold in the Western Conference, but can on their day beat you as well 2 days ago. Then, last night, dominated the Grizzlies. So on this 5-game winning streak, it's not like they're playing any slouches. Yes, they had a really weird close game against the Nets, but it's a crosstown rivalry thing, so not necessarily to worry about that. But ultimately, they're proving that they can put together dominant performances and, most ultimately, from their core 5, get a lot of solid production. It's not just Brunson now who has to carry this team. It's Brunson and Bridges and Towns and OG. Maybe you can throw Precious in there on his day. But ultimately, now they're getting more contributions from the starting 5, whereas last year, saw the starting 5 were gassed because of how long they had to play because of Tom Thibodeau's philosophies. But ultimately, the reason why I'm excited to see this Knicks team amp up is because look at the Eastern Conference. Look at who they might need to face in the postseason. It started today or maybe even down the stretch. The Cavs ultimately are the team to beat. They're playing like perhaps the best team, not just in the Eastern Conference, but in all of basketball. They've proven it against the elite Western Conference teams. But then after that, the Celtics are faltering. I like the Magic. They're certainly one of the better defensive teams in the Eastern Conference. But I don't necessarily know how proven they'll look come postseason time. They certainly have players that can hurt you, but they're kind of like the Knicks last year, where they might be relying a little bit too much on guys like Paolo and Franz Wagner down the stretch. And then you look at the play-in teams that only started on the Indiana Pacers, really declining a lot this year. Some other teams that might end up at the play-in tournament at the very least, the Bulls. I don't know how attractive they will look in the postseason should they get there. So a lot of teams in the Eastern Conference are getting asked questions of them. And the Knicks have proven in this stretch they can beat the quote-unquote elite of the East, but also dominate some teams in the Western Conference who a lot of people are considering to be future title challengers. The Grizzlies could definitely be a team that goes in a hot run in the postseason, gets to the NBA Finals. And potentially on the stretch, they get a chance to beat up on teams like the Thunder and Rockets as well. So that's what makes me excited and a little bit optimistic if I'm a Knicks fan about this run of 4. And if I'm a Nuggets fan, I wouldn't necessarily be panicking right now, because I feel like the Nuggets are a team that feel as if they're tensing up at the wrong moments, but still know they have a trump card in Jokic. And I feel like if they get over that mindset, if they realize that they can contribute around Jokic, that Jokic isn't the end-all, be-all on both sides of the court, I feel like that's when the Nuggets can shine. Because Jokic is the best player, but what he also does very well is make sure he distributes the wealth. He's not a selfish superstar by any means necessary. And this Nuggets team has to buy into that identity and say, hey, if our best player is someone selfish to the point that he wants to succeed, we have to step up to accommodate for that. So that's what makes this Nuggets team so intriguing. They have that mindset in the back of their minds that if they can just step up around Jokic and play around him, then he won't necessarily have to carry him to victory all the time. So that would make this game so interesting. But I'm going to have to go with the Knicks on form here. They won 7 of 10 since. They had lost 3 of 4 actually to start the year. And how having won 7 of 10 puts themselves in a good spot to usurp Boston as the second place team in the Eastern Conference standings. And I feel like if they maintain this pace, they might as well chase down Cleveland too. And if the Knicks are able to do that, I would say they're the ultimate favorite to come out of the Eastern Conference this year. Because you can ignore the factors of depth. You can ignore the factors that Bridges and Towns haven't played for this Knicks team in the postseason and haven't experienced that. But I feel like this Knicks team has proven that they're not just a team in the East looking to take advantage of that weak confidence. They're doing it to teams like Memphis as well. And they might be able to do it tomorrow night against the Nuggets too, and take advantage of this Nuggets semi-losing streak, a mini losing streak for the Nuggets, and take advantage of the fact that right now the Nuggets are not performing around their own superstar. So give me the Knicks in this one. Funnily enough, let me see my notes here. The Nuggets had won 8 of 9 between January 9th and 24th. They had a good start to the year. And in every single matchup have only lost 1 against the Knicks in recent memory. Early on this season, another big dismantling of a Western Conference team on the Knicks. Early in the season, though. So, yes, the Nuggets have had a good stretch of form. But right now, the Knicks are perhaps on the best stretch of form in the entire NBA right now. And have the advantage of playing in the weaker conference. So, look for the Knicks to really come out there and prove to Denver that they are the more complete team. And while I wouldn't start panicking if I'm a Nuggets fan now, I will panic if this is a trend where Jokic has to carry the Nuggets rather than the Nuggets performing around him, because that's a scary proposition for a lot of Nuggets fans to cope with. But coming up next on our show to conclude, we look at another CFP team here in terms of what could be next for 2025, and it is the Oregon Ducks. If you're an Oregon Ducks fan, stick around for this. We'll be right back to talk about it after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And to conclude today's show, we're doing another What's Next segment for our respective CFP team, looking at the Oregon Ducks, looking at what went wrong for them this season and what they could do to retool and rebuild to get back to the same spot in 2025. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. And if you're an Oregon Ducks fan, stick around and feel free to leave any comments throughout this segment. So, the Oregon Ducks, remarkable season, went into the college football playoff as the number 1 overall seed, the only team outside of Michigan to beat Ohio State in the regular season, got a second chance to do it yet again. Ultimately came up against a buzzsaw in the Rose Bowl and fell in that one. And now they head into an off-season of some uncertainty. They lose perhaps one of the best overall quarterbacks of his generation in Dillon Gabriel. Obviously only got one season out of him, but it was a truly remarkable season that saw him go to New York for the Heisman ceremony. You lose Jordan James, one of the most underrated running backs in the entire nation. And then Tez Johnson, who truly had a very prolific career at the wide receiver position for you with both Bo Nix and Dillon Gabriel, and was willing to stay for that one Dillon Gabriel year. But heading into next season, knowing that they've built a nice culture and identity that a lot of people and prospects and recruits, most importantly, are buying into, with head coach Dan Lanning proving that he's one of the best head coaches in college football right now, Eugene's becoming a destination spot of sorts. And the fact that they're now in the Big Ten, and the Big Ten is gaining in not just popularity, but also in strength, Oregon might have staying power, because they're certainly playing the teams that will add to their resume, but they're also proving to be more appealing to a lot of these players looking for a new home. There's a reason that a guy like Dillon Gabriel wanted to spend his last college football year of eligibility in a place like Eugene, Oregon. They had a very talented roster from top to bottom. And if Ohio State didn't turn into a buzzsaw in the CFP, who knows what would have happened for Oregon. So they, even though the fans will be a little bit dismayed by the outcome of the season, will go into the offseason with their heads held high and looking to the future with a look of optimism on their faces. So without further ado, let's talk about what they've been doing this particular offseason to rebuild and rebrand for 2025. So obviously, the one directive that they do have, I just talked about. You have to replace those guys in Gabriel, James, and Johnson, who gave you a lot of offensive production. And so, a lot of the burden will fall on the shoulders of Mr. Dante Moore, one of the more perplexing college football quarterbacks over the past couple of years. Obviously, played a couple games at UCLA, one of the top overall recruits in 2023, the number 3, in fact, overall recruit in this class. Transferred over to Oregon, sat a year behind Dillon Gabriel, now takes the reins for Oregon. And looking at the roster around him, it does kind of look a little bit thin, but you do have Evan Stewart, who's going to be very high profile headed into this year for Oregon. Because remember, he was a former Texas A&M kind of semi-star for them too over the first couple of years of his college career. But he never truly made a name for himself at Texas A&M. He was one of the top recruits in the Jimbo Fisher era at Texas A&M. But there's something to be said about him transferring to Oregon for a new start. And this year, he didn't really have as good a season as people expected him to, but he made some big plays in big games. That first Ohio State meeting notwithstanding. And he truly is someone who I feel like has a couple more years of good college football play left in him. And I feel like looking at this Oregon team, you're going to need a perimeter threat like him to really transform what's going to be a young receiving corps. Speaking of this young receiving corps, let's look at who they got in terms of recruiting. Corian Moore is one of 3 5-star recruits that they were able to get in this year's class. I believe it was a top 5 class, so it just goes to show the recruiting prowess that Dan Lanning has. But one of the biggest recruiting wins for Oregon was Ohio State's loss. We talked about this when we looked at what was next for Ohio State yesterday. Now we're talking about what was once Ohio State's loss and is now Oregon's gain, the flipping of Naeem Offord from Ohio State. That's a huge one. Not just for the physical side of things as he adds a new look to their secondary, which they're losing a couple pieces from, but ultimately getting one over on a Big Ten rival, that's got to feel good if you're Dan Lanning and Oregon. But ultimately, with him, Corian Moore coming in at the wide receiver spot, and offensive tackle Douglas Utu, they're addressing some very key areas of need here. Corian Moore obviously addressing the dynamic potential of this receiving corps. An offensive tackle, Douglas Utu, bolstering that offensive line that's going to lose a lot of players. Josh Connolly, an excellent guard over the past couple of years for Oregon, who fills his shoes. Potentially Douglas Utu. And then Naeem Offord in the secondary, not necessarily the best aspect of this Oregon defense, but certainly can look to improve, and will like seeing Naeem Offord flip, especially from Ohio State. Then, let's look at their work in the transfer portal. Ultimately, I feel like they know what they want to fix and address in the offseason, because there's a similar theme here from what they've done in the recruiting trail, seeing it translate now to what they've done in the transfer portal. They acquired one of the top safeties you could possibly get in this transfer cycle from Purdue. Dylan Thieneman, I think he was the number 1 overall safety prospect actually from Purdue. So him and Offord coming in, really bolstering that secondary. That's losing a lot of pieces, losing a lot of depth, and really bolstering, in my opinion, one of the weaker units for this Oregon team last year. And then, a Nevada transfer, also an offensive lineman, Isaiah World, and also bolstering the signing of Douglas Utu by adding another guy for Dante Moore up front. And I feel like all of these additions are perfect and speak volumes to what Dan Lanning wants to build and what he saw last season that he potentially didn't like. I feel like now, knowing that you're not going to have Dillon Gabriel, and you have now this very raw quarterback in Dante Moore, who a lot of people were excited about coming out of high school, we haven't really seen too much of in terms of his college experience. Adding a lot of talent up front in both Utu and Isaiah World really will help Dante Moore gain comfortability. And also help him display the talent that UCLA saw in him and that Oregon believed in the transfer portal as well. So I really like the fact that Dan Lanning is building to the trenches to better protect his quarterback. Then, in terms of this recruiting class, in terms of these 3 5-star recruits they were able to get, I really like the signing of Naeem Offord. Not just because it's a flip from OSU, but it bolsters a position and a position group, most importantly, that had struggled most of last year. Then getting Dylan Thiedemann, one of the great leaders at the safety position, even though he played for a school like Purdue, which is not necessarily known for being good in any one department. By getting him, he could be one of the vocal leaders of the secondary next season. And then ultimately, obviously, Isaiah World as well, a very experienced offensive tackle to protect Dante Moore. But ultimately, I also love it for what it didn't address, allowing for some of these players to really step up. Because when I think about the best of what's left behind for Oregon, some players who are still going to be with the program, Nolan Whittington on the offensive side of the football, the running back position, Matayo Uyunglele in the middle of the front seven for the defensive side of the football. This success in both recruiting and the transfer portal translates into what you already have in terms of infrastructure. So Dan Lanning not only was able to address what needed to be fixed, but realized what he didn't need. He realized that there are key players in certain areas that can already help bolster the profile of Oregon football in 2025. And that's what's remarkable about this team. Because who knows what the Big Ten is going to look like next year? Who knows, right? Because Ohio State's breaking in a new quarterback. Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, potentially, all breaking in new quarterbacks. Well, actually, maybe not Illinois because Luke Altmaier has another year of eligibility. I'm intrigued to see how he improves, though. Some underrated teams, potentially. Washington, potentially, can make some noise in the Big Ten next year. So, I feel like Oregon has had the most success of a team in the Big Ten who made the playoff in terms of retooling and rebuilding to prepare for next year. And so that's why I'm really intrigued to see how all of these pieces that Dan Lanning addressed in the offseason with the addition of these players and prospects pans out in 2025, because the Oregon Ducks, make no ands, ifs, or buts about it, could be primed for a very exciting year, one way or another. Let me know what you think about this Oregon Ducks team in 2025 in the comments, because that will just about do it for the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast for today. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in to today's show. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network if you haven't done so already. Make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features as well. But other than that, I'm out for today. See you all tomorrow.